The second bit of content that you need to know for the social approach in psychology is prejudice and discrimination. Now, prejudice refers to the form of judgment, usually but not always negative, about somebody before you know anything about them. So making that judgment about someone before you know anything. Now, discrimination is the resulting behaviour from prejudice. So once you've made a prejudice about somebody, you will have discriminatory behaviour toward them because of the prejudice. Now, there are three elements to the prejudice. So the first one is the cognitive element. Now, this involves the belief held about the group, which will form a stereotype, common but often simple views about a particular group of people. The affective element includes the feelings experienced in response to the group. So, for example, you might feel angry towards them or hate them, and particularly when you encounter a member of that group. And this is a pre-set negative attitude, and this is the prejudice that leads to the discrimination. And the behavioural element at the bottom, which is the unfair treatment of a person or group resulting in the discrimination. Now, social identity theory, which is the theory of prejudice that we're looking at by Tajfel and Turner in 1979, suggests quite simply that prejudice will occur from the formation of groups and nothing else. Now, Tajfel and Turner say that these groups will be called an in-group and an out-group. Now, the in-group will always be the group that refers to themselves as us, and the out-group will always be the group that are them. So any group that I see myself as part of, that to me is my in-group, and any group that I am not a part of, I will see as the out-group. Now, we're loyal to, and we will always put the needs of those in our in-group before anybody else, especially the out-group. Now, Tajfel and Turner suggest that prejudice comes from how people see themselves in relation to the members of their social group. And you can see on the flow diagram there the process that we go through. So we belong to a group, and this creates an element of self-categorisation. We will categorise ourselves as being part of that group. Now, this will lead to in-group favouritism. I will favour my group above any other. Now, as a result of that, hostility will arise toward the out-group. And I need to feel like my group is superior, it's better than the out-group, so that my self-esteem is increased and I feel superior. Now, social identity theory suggests that there are three phases or three subcategories that we will go through. Now, the first is social categorisation, and this is the part where I categorise myself as being a part of the in-group. Now, we might have a number of different in-groups. We might be blonde or female or a teenager or a Christian. Social identification is where we identify with that group more openly. So we start to adopt the norms, the beliefs, the attitudes of the group. And social comparison is the final stage, where we will always compare our in-group with the out-group. And it's really important, as I just mentioned, for our self-esteem, that we see our group, the in-group, as better than the out-group. From this, Tajfel and Turner say that the prejudice thoughts are born, and it is from the prejudice that discriminatory behaviour will come from. Social identity theory is actually great in terms of explaining a range of phenomena such as racism or class conflict, but it's only a partial explanation for our tendency to favour people within our own country. It suggests that the in-group is central to your self-categorisation, your self-worth, and how you see yourself in terms of the comparisons to the other group. Now, there are three elements to the prejudice. So the first one is the cognitive element. Now, this involves the belief held about the group, which will form a stereotype, common but often simple views about a particular group of people. The affective element includes the feelings. In January 2011, it was the 12 marker. It was a situational scenario question with the vamps and the howlers. It's quite a famous question among teachers, this one really, where participants, pupils, would have to be able to identify the in-group and out-group and discuss social identity theory as a description or as an explanation of what had happened, but also as an evaluation of prejudice. This is the mark screen on the board if you want to have a look. Don't include a conclusion, you will not get past the level 3. An example question if you want to practice: describe social identity theory in reference to how it explains prejudice for 4 marks. In January 2011, it was the 12 marker. It was a situational scenario question with the vamps and the howlers. It's quite a famous question among teachers, this one really, where participants, pupils, would have to be able to identify the in-group and out-group and discuss social identity theory as a description or as an explanation of what had happened, but also as an evaluation of prejudice. It's really important, particularly with the new spec, if you're after these higher grades, that you refer to these key terms on the board. So we've got heterogeneous, which is the tendency to see individuals in a group as unique or all different and all favourable. Now this is what happens with your in-group. You will view your in-group as every character is unique. You might have Emma and Sarah and Michelle, who will all be friends in your in-group, but will also be seen as individuals to you. Now the opposite of this is homogeneous. Now this is where you view the outgroup as everybody's the same. You won't see them as individuals or as different personalities. You will just go, oh yeah, they're all goths, and you will classify them as all the same and all unfavourable, and you won't get to know them as individuals. It's really important that you are able to reference research in social identity theory. Now this has often been a question that's come up on the SAMs. And something that we're going to look at here is Tajfel's series of experiments, which are actually called minimum group experiments. Now in this, Tajfel demonstrates the human tendency for groups to form social identities and that this will lead to prejudice. Now in experiment 1, accurate or inaccurate estimations, 64 adolescent boys, all in the UK from a comprehensive school, were tested to see whether they would have discrimination toward another group. Now Tajfel did this by asking the boys initially to estimate how many dots on a screen were being flashed. The boys were then categorised into 4 groups of 8 boys, and they were told that these types of tasks, some people overestimate how many dots were given and some people underestimate how many dots were given, and they were classified in groups based on this. But the under and overestimates didn't reflect accuracy. So what that means is they were randomly assigned to the groups. Now in the value condition, which was the condition 2, again we had 4 groups of 8 boys, but these boys were told that in these type of tasks some people are just slightly more accurate than others. After this, the experimenters randomly assigned 2 of the neutrals and 2 of the value group to a further procedure. And these boys were categorised and told that one group were the boys who estimated high, one group were the boys that estimated low, one group had accurate guesses and the other group had less accurate guesses. From here, the boys had to complete a task where they were given monetary rewards or penalties to their own group or another group, but they were not told the identities for the individuals within the other group. Each boy was given information about the group that they belonged to, and they were given it in a booklet. The boys then had to choose a number. Now this number represented the reward or the penalty given to their own group member or a member of a different group. Tajfel found that there was no difference between the neutral or the value condition, but he did find significant in-group favouritism and significant negative out-group bias. Now this means that the boys favoured their own groups and gave their own groups the rewards when they could, and had a negative out-group bias. They didn't want to help a group that they didn't belong to. They didn't want to give them anything. Now this is all seen in relation to calculating the monetary rewards or the penalties that they gave. Now this is quite a difficult study to understand. It's really important that you know that the results and the conclusion. You only need to know a few sentences really about the method in order to be able to summarise it. So my advice when you're revising this is just come up with a couple of sentences, one sentence maybe for the aim, a couple of sentences for the method, a couple of sentences for the results, and actually what Tajfel concludes. Tajfel realised that social categorisation was not adequate in the first experiment, so he actually did an experiment number 2. Experiment 2 is called Klee and Kandinsky. Now this is one of the more famous experiments that Tajfel did. Now again, he took British schoolboys from the same Bristol Comprehensive School, and they were 14 to 15-year-old boys. Now this time he put them in 3 groups of 16, and he told them that researchers were investigating their art preferences. In a lab, they were shown 12 images of artwork by either Klee or Kandinsky, with the artist's signatures removed, and they were just asked to say which ones they liked the best. They were then divided into 2 groups, either Klee or Kandinsky, based on their art preferences, but in fact again it was a random allocation to the groups. The boys were then given the task of allocating points to each other, and they were told that the points could later be converted into prizes. The boys didn't know which individuals they were allocating the money to, but they did know which group they were in, so whether they were part of their own group or whether they were part of the other group. Now Tajfel did this by asking the boys initially to estimate how many dots on a screen were being flashed. Basically, the boys could choose whether they rewarded their own group or the out-group, whether they punished their own group or the out-group, or whether they showed fairness to both groups. Tajfel found that when they wanted to see whether the boys would discriminate, they're in favour of the in-group and has shown negative out-group bias. The majority opted to maximise the difference in favour of the in-group, and this was clearly in the best interest because they were told that the points meant prizes. The boys overwhelmingly chose to allocate points to the boys who'd been identified as in the same group as themselves, either overestimates or underestimates. Boys consistently rewarded their own group, ignoring the fair alternative, and therefore they did demonstrate an in-group favouritism. This is regardless of the fact that the boys had no idea who was in their own group. Boys failed to maximise their own profit in order to ensure that the out-group was penalised. Now, this is a really reliable study. It was a lab study, there were strict controls, it was very replicable in terms of the fact that if the study would be repeated, you would get the same results. And it supports that we have a natural tendency to favour the in-group and discriminate against the out-group. It's very useful to explain to us how prejudice works, and it's consistent with social identity theory, suggesting that you just have to have the presence of the two groups for prejudice to occur. The groups were completely meaningless, so it was a control that Tajfel put in place, ensuring that there was no historical competition between the sets of boys. However, it could be argued that the forced choice nature of the implied a competition, so the boys did discriminate. So does it really support realistic conflict theory? For example, within Klee and Kandinsky, the boys were told that the points meant prizes, therefore that's a competition between the two groups. So actually, if we're going for the higher ability marks, we could argue that this supports realistic conflict theory. The study's been replicated with tests on different samples. Losky, Ortex and Hepburn, 1980, created explicitly random groups, removed the forced task and actually asked them to divide poker chips between anonymous members of their group, and they found strong in-group favouritism as well. Further studies have tested other groups, for example adults. So in Cardiff, Branthwaite et al. Found female adults in California and soldiers in the German army, and these all showed minimal group effect as within Tajfel's original research. This is important because you need to be prepared in the exam for a question that asks you to support social identity theory using research. Now, the validity is very questionable of Tajfel's research. Now, perhaps the boys were only behaved in this way because they knew they were in an experiment. It was in a university setting, it wasn't natural to the boys, so it might have been demand characteristics, so they worked out what the expected behaviour was of them and then they behaved in that way. It also seems to lack population validity because it was a limited sample of British schoolboys, so therefore can't be generalised. Also, when evaluating social identity theory, remember that this isn't the only explanation. We've actually got realistic conflict theory that suggests that it's the prejudice that occurs throughout competition and not just the presence of a different group. We also talked about brown eyes, blue eyes, and there's a YouTube link there if you want to watch that. Now, Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes was Jane Elliott, in 1970, and is one of the most famous psychological situations. Now, she wanted to see, because of the racial segregation during the 1970s in the US, she wanted to see if she could create this within a group. So she taught her all-white primary school class what it's like to be a victim. So she told them that the blue-eyed kids were smarter than the brown-eyed kids, and that they shouldn't mix with each other at break time, and that the blue-eyed kids can only use the water fountain. The results were devastating. The blue-eyed kids became arrogant, separatist, performed better academically, although we could argue self-fulfilling prophecy, which you'll study in your second year. However, a week later, she claimed she made a mistake and she reversed it, and found exactly the same results when she reversed it. And the conclusion from this is getting children to experience empathy at a young age would encourage tolerance later in life. There is other support for social identity theory as well. Saldini, I'm very sorry if I've said that wrong, in 1976, analysed results of US football teams, and she found that people were much more likely to say that we won and they lost, even when referenced to their own football team. And this is an example of the exam question I was talking to you about, where you've got to talk about psychological research to evaluate social identity theory. Be aware that you might have an 8-mark evaluate. Now obviously 8-mark evaluate means describe and evaluate now, and if it's an 8-mark or above you must include a conclusion question.